Dobrodošli u emisiju koja vas stavlja u centar važnih razgovora u društvu. Večeras u nešto malo izmenjenom formatu jer imamo jednog sagovornika, ali tu su naši panelisti kao što i očekujete. Večeras sa nama je Januš Bugajski. Razgovaramo o tome kako iz Vašingtona izgledaju i Crna Gora i region. Dakle, o tome večeras počinje još jedna velika debata. Januš Bugajski je viši savjetnik u Jamestown Fondaciji. To je think tank organizacija iz Vašingtona koja je osnovana onda kada je u Ameriku prebegao najviše rangirani funkcioner Sovjetskog saveza ikada. Njegovo ime bilo je Arkadij Ševčenko. Sama fondacija je dakle osnovana prvobitno s namerom da podrži disidente iz Sovjetskog saveza, potom i disidente iz čitavog istočnog bloka, a onda decenijama razvijala je svoju aktivnost u političkim analizama. Dakle, jednu od takvih političkih analiza večeras pravimo sa Janušem Bugajskim. On razume naše jezike sa Balkana, ali ćemo večeras ipak razgovarati na engleskom, koji je njegov maternji jezik. Welcome.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, I told that Jamestown Foundation was founded after Arkadij Ševčenko defect from Soviet Union to United States. Could you have imagined that the foundation once again can be dedicated to supporting Russian dissidents?
Well, for those of us who understood that the fall of communism did not mean the fall of Russian imperialism, yes. The struggle continues and the opposition to the regime in Moscow continues as well.
So it is not new for you?
It's not new. Jamestown has been very active. It wasn't just a question of the struggle against communism. It was a question of helping and analyzing new countries that were emerging from the former Soviet Empire, from the former Soviet bloc. The new countries now, particularly that have emerged from the Soviet Union, which are now under increasing pressure and war from Russia itself. And the main part of Jamestown is, I think, what we call Eurasia. In other words, it's not just European part of the post-communist world, but it's also the Central Asia, the Caucasus, and China. We do a lot of work on China as well. So there's never a dull moment. There's always some sort of conflict, some sort of struggle, some sort of aspiration. And even though we're not strictly a policy institute, a lot of our analysis is very widely read. It's one of the, I think, the most respected institutes for in-depth analysis of current events throughout the Eurasian region.
Let's talk about the Balkans. How does Montenegro look like to you? After how long you have been here again?
How long? Well, I've been traveling to Montenegro since the early 90s. I was here for the first elections, first free elections, 1990. But yeah, most recently I was here 2 or 3 months ago. We met at that time for the show. I try to travel to the region as much as possible. It's not always that easy because I have other places to go to as well, but sometimes I'm trying to combine with other trips. But I've always found myself at home here, right from the very beginning. It's very strange. Much more so, I would say, than some of the neighboring republics.
So how does Montenegro look like you in this moment?
At this moment, I would say Montenegro stands at a crossroads. I think this is a very important phase that Montenegro has entered. On the one hand, the country's registered so much success over the past 20 years, I would say, since the collapse of Yugoslavia. It resisted being drawn into war, avoided ethnic conflicts. It hosted many, many refugees, which I think is very much appreciated in Washington to this day. It also was managed to escape from that Yugoslavia, that stranglehold from Belgrade, declared independence, qualified for NATO, and that is quite astonishing as well, and qualified for NATO after, I would say, a long period of reform and transformation. And because of the economic reforms it's undergone as well, now is beginning to qualify for EU membership. So that's the positive side. The negative side, unfortunately, Montenegro is also a target. It's always been a Russian target, as you know, in the region. For many years, even as far back as the 19th century, this was the target for access to the Adriatic. It's a target now, I would say, for subverting NATO from within. I call it NATO's internal front. We have an eastern front, we have a southern front, we have a northern front. Now we have an internal front where Russia and its proxies or partners or agents are trying to disturb, undermine, unsettle, divide NATO from within. And I think Montenegro here is a major target of that adventure, if you like, of that policy. And at the same time, you have another factor, which is over the last several years has become more pronounced, and that is this pan-Serbian world agenda. Not exactly like Milosevic, not through war, but through subversion, through domination, through economic measures like open Balkans. In other words, the smaller countries are supposed to be subverted by Belgrade and create a larger Serbian sphere of influence in the region. And again, Montenegro is a target. In this, I would say, in this agenda of the Serbian world, Srpski svet.
You used the word crossroad. Where? To where?
The crossroad I'm talking about is between a European future, a transatlantic future, close relations with the United States and with the United Kingdom, entry and membership of the European Union. That's on the one side, and prosperity, stability that comes with it, which it does. I mean, that's a fact. Or some sort of neutral status, or a status that's attached to the Serbian and Russian worlds, which is not democratic, which is less opaque, which is more corrupt, and more serving the interests of what I call the last empire in Europe, which is the Russian Federation. So that's the crossroads.
And what is your prediction for Montenegro?
I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist. Montenegro, I think, will make it, but you can't sit back and assume it's going to happen automatically. Montenegrins have to work hard to make sure their country does not fall into the trap that's been set by both Belgrade and Moscow. It needs to make sure it qualifies for the European Union, and it needs to elect the politicians that will keep it on the same track that it has been for several years.
Let's try to see a bit wider picture. Let's talk about Balkans as a region. Is it so important for American foreign policy like it was in 20th century?
Not as important, to be honest, not as important as in the 1990s. When I used to come here in the 1990s during the war, luckily there was no war in Montenegro, as I mentioned, it was very different. This was #1 priority. I remember testifying in various Senate and House committees in Washington what to do about the war, how to prevent the war from spreading, how to end the war, how to create some sort of peace deal. So that was a major preoccupation. I would say it was almost the second, if not the first priority of American policy. Of course, that has subsided. Over the past 20 years, and particularly now, the focus is on Russia and China. And of course, the main focus now in Washington is Russia's war against Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, but the Balkans, I don't think, have been neglected. They haven't been fully neglected, let's put it this way. Not enough attention, however, is being paid. And this is one of the reasons I would like to bring more attention to the region, because there is a danger that this region could again explode into some sort of conflict and potential armed conflict, potential violence. And it always happens when Washington isn't focused enough on the region. Because, and again, I believe European Union has great attributes, great bonuses, benefits, but it doesn't handle war situations. It doesn't handle conflict situations very well, you know, for various reasons, historical reasons and practical reasons. So, again, to answer your question, not as enough attention as there should be, but I think more attention should be, can be generated for Washington.
How?
By paying attention to the problems.
How?
By telling policymakers, informing policymakers, in both houses, but also in the executive, exactly what's at stake in this region. And if you tie it, which I very much do, to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, that it's part of a similar stage, the same stage, then I think there's more attention will be paid to the region. And at the same time, solutions. We need to have solutions, recommendations for what's the best way to prevent the sort of conflicts that are brewing.
Suggested from Balkans people?
From both. I mean, you know, people like me, I mean, I'm not from this region, but I've been dealing with the region for 30 or so years. And people like myself are listened to in Washington. But also people on the ground here. There's some very good analysts here in the region who need to be more engaged, I believe, with Washington and with policymakers.
I will remind you that in one interview in 2018, I think, Donald Trump, during his presidential term, stated that America, as a member of NATO, could enter the Third World War because of Montenegrins. You remember that? Yeah. Switching power to President Biden, it was expected, at least here, that there would be an American U-turn regarding Balkans' problems and needs. In your opinion, did that happen?
Well, first of all, with Trump, it just shows you how important Montenegro is if it can start World War III. Sometimes big wars start from smaller incidents and in small countries. We see where World War I started in Sarajevo.
That's right.
So, you know, one shouldn't laugh at this completely. I don't think Trump himself...
Neither we in Montenegro, believe me.
I don't think Trump himself understands what Montenegro is. To be honest, I don't think he understands much about the Balkans. He's never been focused on the Balkans. I think it was a bit of an exaggeration by the populist right about NATO, the future of NATO, that they have doubts about. I think that was that question.
Yes, that's right.
Under Biden, I would say the expectations were very high because he had such long-term experience in the 90s and since then in the region. His son even served, as you know, in Kosovo.
Kosovo, that's right.
I used to testify under Biden in the Senate when he was there, when he was head of the Senate Foreign.
As a senator, yeah.
When he was a senator. So he has that experience. There's a lot of expectations that he would somehow resolve everything very quickly. Sometimes one has to be a bit more patient. I think the strategy is sound, but I don't think there's enough emphasis, enough, let's say, carrots and sticks in this region. And still, I think we leave a lot to European negotiators, particularly as you see in the Serbia-Kosovo attempts to resolve that conflict. It's when America steps in that things move faster. That's why I think America should step in more.
How to raise a voice from this part of Balkans, which is not Serbia and which is not Kosovo?
You've got, Montenegro's got to stress how important it is. There's two ways of getting attention. One, to start a war, then everybody pays attention. And the other is to say that this is how we can help your agenda for Europe and help your agenda vis-à-vis Russia and ultimately help your agenda vis-à-vis China. Because if Montenegro is successful, if it avoids that sort of, I would even call it state capture by Serbia and imperial capture by Russia, then I think it's a plus, it's a bonus for America's agenda in Europe.
Does the same apply to American foreign policy as it does to European policy? That it is not longer consistent policy, one policy. Instead, it is a puzzle of different interests represented by lobbyist groups.
Well, lobbyists have some influence, but I wouldn't exaggerate their influence in Washington.
Really?
Yeah, sometimes I think governments or politicians pay a lot of money to lobbyists thinking that they're going to be successful. It doesn't often happen. We see this now in the case of, won't mention the politicians, in the case of Albania, where there's a huge scandal, as you know, regarding lobbyists, FBI, and so on and so forth. I don't think that's the best way to get your point across. You may reach a few politicians for a short period of time, but I don't think you're necessarily going to influence policy. The best way to influence policy is to have an electorate that votes for the sort of politicians that America wants to listen to and to have as partners and allies in Europe. It's also NGOs, it's analysts, and as I said, there are very good Montenegrin and other analysts in the region, need to talk to their counterparts.
For example?
For example, I'd rather not name names because people get offended if I mention one person and not another. So, you know, I'm trying to be fair, but, you know, every country in this region, I've traveled quite a lot, has some very good analysts, both in terms of local affairs, but also in terms of US policy. And I think they should be plugged in much more into the debate.
The American Special Envoy for the Balkans, Gabriel Escobar, warned that the Russians will interfere in the presidential campaign in Montenegro, but also says that, that he expected the Montenegrin institution to resist it. In the part of the pro-Western public here, that statement was assessed by hypocritical, in a situation where Montenegro is completely institutional blocked, and for which the official policy in Washington is also responsible.
Yeah, I would say there's two problems with this statement. First problem is there are some people in Montenegro that welcome Russian interference, and some institutions also welcome Russian involvement or interference, money, etc. So I think that statement is sort of half true. There are Montenegrin, of course, institutions that want to resist, Montenegrin parties, Montenegrin politicians that resist that interference. The second part is as you have said, that America itself isn't doing enough to help block Russian involvement in this region. Sometimes I fear that we say a lot, but we don't do enough. And I've always been urging a sort of trans-regional and trans-functional campaign to try to thwart and remove as much Russian state influence as possible. I'm not talking about ordinary Russians. I'm not talking about tourists or businessmen.
Yes, of course.
I'm talking about state capture, Russian state capture of institutions, church, civil society organizations, nationalist groups, political parties, and so on. We see that here in Montenegro. This is where I think America should be more active on a regional basis.
Yes, my question was, how big is the American share in the problems facing Montenegro?
Well, American share in the sense that I think part of the problem with America is we do so much, and then we say either mission accomplished, or we say, well, the European Union can handle the rest. And I think that's been part of the problem, that we've said, look, Montenegro now is part of NATO, so that job is done, it's finished. Now the next part is for Montenegro to qualify for the European Union. But that's not our job, that's not American job, that's the European job.
Right, but for example, Open Balkans initiative is mainly American initiative.
It mainly, but not completely. I think it's a mistake. I don't think it's understood sufficiently. This is potentially both an arm of the Serbian government, but it's also something a little more, which is some sort of deal that's been brewing between Tirana and Belgrade for several years to try and divide political influence in this region. And this is why Albania has gone along with it, but Kosovo hasn't, because Kosovo does not want to fall under direct Albanian influence. Similarly, between Montenegro and Serbia. Montenegro does not want to fall under Serbian influence. So it's, again, I don't think there's enough understanding in Washington, even in this administration, about what the open
Escobar
Balkans is.
insisted on that idea.
Well, this is precisely the sort of thing that needs to be discussed, that they need to listen to this in Washington. I'm sorry?
Do you discuss about that with him?
I write about it, I discuss about it, but not enough. There's never enough time. And remember, there is a lot of focus now on Ukraine. So
yes.
People aren't listening as much as they should be to things like Open Balkans.
But could we make some parallel between Ukraine issues and Balkan problems?
Absolutely, absolutely. Look, I see the policy from Belgrade as a sort of mini imperialism, like a younger brother version of what Putin is doing in his neighborhood. And in many respects, I see the relationship between Serbia and Montenegro as mirroring the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. In other words, the Russians view Ukrainians as younger brothers, sub-ethnics, they don't have their own language, they don't have their own religion. Very similar to how Serbia views Montenegro.
Yeah. Let's go to our old capital, Cetinje. We have our Jelena Mirković on Cetinje. Dobroveče, hoćemo li ovako sada? Zamolit ću vas da svoje pitanje postavite na engleskom ako je to moguće, ako ne, prevodit ćemo. Hvala i slušamo vas.
Hello, special hello to our guest. Welcome to Montenegro. I'm interested, what do you see as the biggest political problems in Montenegro?
Thanks for the question. Hello, Cetinje. Biggest problem, I would say, is lack of a government that can conduct the sort of reforms that are necessary for Montenegro to qualify for European Union entry, to close all the chapters and to finally make that next step towards European Union, as Croatia did, as Slovenia did, if you look at the former Yugoslavia. I think Montenegro is the next country that will qualify. I think it's well ahead of others, certainly well ahead, I would say, of Serbia, even Macedonia, North Macedonia and Bosnia. But it needs a government to push those reforms through. It's almost as though it's deliberately blocked now because of somebody else's regional agenda.
Deliberately.
Yes.
That is the key word.
Deliberate. It's not. I don't think it is an accident, as they used to say in communist times. I don't think it is an accident that Montenegro does not have a functioning government. For some political actors, it's better not to have a Montenegrin government or a paralyzed Montenegrin government than it is to have a functioning one. That's why it's very important, I think, after these presidential elections, to have a parliamentary election for a government with a fresh mandate of the people, for the country, so it can move forward.
How is the current government, the government in technical mandate, viewed in Washington? I'm not asking about your opinion. I'm asking about official U.S. policy view.
I think that it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, initially this government, a non-DPS government, was supported for various reasons. They thought the DPS and Đukanović himself had spent too long in office. They thought that a new coalition would bring more vigor, more youth. But I think some people have become disillusioned that this government has got to such a dead end, and it's dysfunctional, and it doesn't pass the legislation that's necessary. So I think there's a little bit of disillusionment that's creeped in with this government, with this current... I mean, the caretaker government is there to take care, right? But there's nothing that they're particularly taking care of. It's like standing still at the moment.
How do you see it? What is your...
Well, I think there should be early elections. I don't think this can continue. I mean, the constitutional questions need to be resolved as quickly as possible. Need to be fresh elections and a new boost for pushing Montenegro's reforms forward.
You recently wrote in an analysis that the presidential elections in Montenegro on March 19th are an important test for the stability of the Western Balkans. In what way?
Absolutely. If there is, let's say, a candidate that wins who is either extremely weak or is very pro-Belgrade and even pro-Moscow, then I think we're going to witness Montenegro being increasingly blocked from the institutions that it belongs to or should belong to. I fear not only blockage in terms of the European Union, but increasingly questioning its commitments to NATO, reversing those commitments, as well as regional questions, you know, recognition of Kosovo, relations with Bosnia and so on. I think all those will come under question, and I think it will encourage those forces that want to spread this Serbian nationalist mini-imperialism throughout the region. Because if Montenegro begins to fall, I think it will encourage in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo, to push more for the Belgrade agenda.
You call Serbian Orthodox Church the anchor of Serbian nationalism in many of your analyses. Why? Because
it's true.
I mean, how?
Because, well, I mean, we've seen this since the collapse of communism, how the Orthodox churches traditionally, I would say, as we know, are very closely aligned with the state, whatever the state. And we even saw during communist times how the churches collaborated with the communists, even though we have atheists and Orthodox collaborating. But in the case, I would say, of the Serbian Orthodox Church, it has this regional predominance. It has this historical mandate since Montenegro was conquered by Serbia and the Montenegrin church, Orthodox Church, was subdued and its property taken. It has the sort of, if you like, the legal mandate to control the religious life of this country, of Montenegro. And it uses that, I would say, as a conduit for nationalism, for this greater Serbian agenda, for the sort of one Serbian nation idea in which Montenegro is basically either the younger brother or really doesn't exist. You know, this is the Serbian nationalist program. Again, very similar to the Russian Orthodox Church and its control over the Ukrainian Church up until a few years ago in 2019, when finally the Ukrainian Church regained its autocephaly and was recognized internationally and by the ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul.
During the protest over the law of freedom of religion and during the Lydia processions, the dominant narrative from America was reduced to concern that the former communist government was trying to deal with Christian believers. First, how did it come to be the dominant narrative?
Again, it's ignorance, but it's also, part of it is ignorance, I would say, in terms of the Montenegrin Orthodox Church here and what it represents, what it stands for historically. Part of it, I think, is wishful thinking to try and appease the Serbian population and the Serbian nationalists, that we shouldn't press too hard, the government shouldn't press too hard against the Serbian Orthodox Church because then you'll stir Serbian nationalism even more. I would say the opposite. The more you give the nationalists, the more they want. I don't think they can be appeased in that sense. So the idea that somehow the Montenegrin government was oppressing Christianity is part of that nationalist agenda, part of nationalist rhetoric, narrative. That
they were very loud then.
Yeah, yeah. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the right move was made at that particular time. But I think it should have been done in such a way that it was much clearer to the population and to the Americans what the government was pushing for, which was full freedom for all religions, but also recognition. You know, one of the commandments is thou shalt not steal. And yet the Serbian Orthodox Church did steal property from the Montenegrin Orthodox Church. And there are an increasing number of believers of the original church in this country. They should also have their religious rights.
So is that point of view on the role of the Serbian Orthodox Church changing in this moment or not?
I don't think there's enough focus on that in Washington, quite frankly. It's not discussed enough. Whenever I talk to officials, it's more a question of freedom of religion. I don't think they understand the details of what freedom of religion means here.
Do we have another question from our panelists? Am I right? Shall we go to I think, Bijelopolje? Shall we go to North? Asmir Čaković.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and pleasant day to our guests in our country. Welcome. My question is, does the policy of bargaining with the West has paid off for a president of Serbia in context of Kosovo? Thank you.
Sorry, hello there. Could you repeat that? Because I think I missed a little bit. The policy of...
Yeah. Does the policy of bargaining with the West has paid off for Serbian president in context to Kosovo?
When you say bargaining, you mean this sort of balancing act that Vučić is trying to undertake?
It is nicely said.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I personally think that Vučić sees himself in many respects as the new Tito. In other words, that he can balance East vis-a-vis West. That as a result, Serbia will gain more prominence than it has, that it will gain benefits from both sides. But I think this is a false balance. The world no longer is as it was during the Cold War.
But the question was, has it paid off for him?
Well, it's only up to a point. It's paid off in the sense that the pressure hasn't been exerted on him as it should be. Vis-a-vis Kosovo. But now, again, with this agreement that's increasingly being talked over, re-establishing or normalizing, if you like, relations between the two, I think he is going to come under increasing pressure.
If not the both countries, Kosovo and Serbia, it is, de facto, it is recognition. or you think different?
Well, it's not exactly recognition, but it steps towards recognition. And he has to sell that at home now, which I think he's probably engaged in, from what I've seen of the Serbian press. But has it paid off? I don't think it's paid off in the sense that what he wanted was not to recognize Kosovo and for there to be a new status agreed on Kosovo. And in that sense, he's failed.
You talked about policy of carrot and stick. Is there any carrot for Vučić?
Is there any carrot for Vučić? Well, the carrot is ultimately European Union membership.
Or could Montenegro will be some kind of carrot for Vučić? That is the main question here.
Oh, I see what you mean. I cannot see that. Montenegro has too much support. You're saying from Washington.
Yes.
Has too much support as an independent member of NATO, part of the alliance, close partner of the United States. I can't see anybody in Washington agreeing to Montenegro being subsumed under Serbia as part of the Serbian.
Lateral damage of whole this process.
No, I think this is a bit of a conspiracy theory. I don't think so. I haven't heard anybody talk in those sort of terms. This is not the old days where you could simply move a country into another country. And the fact that we're defending Ukraine to the extent we are, and Ukraine has been not only attacked politically, but militarily, indicates that we're willing to defend the independence and territorial integrity of not only NATO countries, but also NATO partners. As a NATO state, as a NATO ally, Montenegrin integrity, territorial integrity and political independence is the key, is vital.
You said there are three main targets of the Serbian game on the Balkans: Montenegro, Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's concentrate on Montenegro. You said that Vučić planning a union of Serbia and Montenegro, modeled on Putin's aspiration for a union of Russia and Belarus. What will depend on whether he will succeed or not in this game?
Well, this is again to answer that question of previous listener,
right.
that he is failing in this project if Montenegro is determined to strengthen its independence, integrity and movement towards European Union. And if America and the European Union act together to make sure that this Serbian world program is not successful.
But obviously we have a battle on the ground.
Oh, there is a battle. This is a struggle. That's why I'm saying it's a crossroads in which every side is engaged. United States, European Union, Montenegro, Serbia, other countries in the region. It's all part of the struggle. But again, to answer your question, I think ideally Vučić would like to see some sort of, if not incorporation of Montenegro in a greater Serbia, a subsumation of Montenegrin foreign and security policy to Serbia's foreign and security policy. That they're in sync, that Montenegro no longer opposes Belgrade, and that Serbia is the dominant partner. So that, I think, is the aspiration. I'm an optimist. I don't think it's going to happen, but in order, again, to achieve what you want, you need to be strong, you need to make sure you win the struggle.
This week is the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Zoran Đinđić. Can you imagine 2 decades? Did you know him?
I met him in Belgrade many, many years ago. I found him a very decent guy. I don't think Montenegro would be under the sort of pressure it is under if he had been president or prime minister. Again, one can speculate. I'm sure there were forces that he would have to fight against and try and win over, because Serbian nationalism does have strong roots in the country. But certainly, if Đinđić was there, let's put it this way, I don't think Serbia would be such a close partner of Russia at this point and exerting so much pressure on Montenegro.
Yeah, that was my question. Thank you. And now we'll go on Tuzi. Aysela Kajošević wants to answer something. Good evening to you.
Yes, hello from Tuzi and welcome to our guest. Dobroveče I za naše gledaoce kraj malih ekrana također.
Hvala vam što ste to rekli.
About my question, Can you tell us what do you think is more likely, a delay in the enlargement of the European Union or a revival of the process? Thank you.
Delay or revival?
That's a very good question. I think at the moment everything is on hold because of the focus of the European Union, as well as the United States, of course, on Ukraine, on Russia, and what kind of European Union will emerge after that war. And even though there's a lot of unity now in dealing with Russia, there are still deep divisions within the European Union on the post-war situation. So I don't think at this point anybody's going to take any major decisions on enlargement. At the same time, it gets very interesting because there are voices now increasingly in Britain that we made a mistake in Brexit. And Brexit was supposed to be the beginning of the enlargement process, beginning of the end of the enlargement process. Now it looks as though Europe could be revived again, the European Union project. So again, I wouldn't give up. And the reforms are not simply for Montenegro to be part of the Union, but the reforms are also beneficial for Montenegro to attract investment and to help itself economically and in terms of its links with the European Union. Again, to answer your question directly, nobody knows, but I see signs of, at the moment, stagnation, but potentially after this war, after Ukraine wins, which I think it will, a new vigor in European Union.
How to push toward that optimistic part of your answer?
To make sure that Ukraine wins. Remember, Ukraine also wants to be part of the European Union. I don't think it will enter anytime soon necessarily, but I think it's getting a lot of positive support from within the Union because of the way, not only because of the war, but because of the reforms they've enacted, even during this war within Ukraine. And I think that will also stimulate a fresh look at the Balkan countries. In other words, people are going to say, well, all these Balkan countries should be part of the European Union and part of NATO to prevent any future foreign aggression against them, because that is a shield that helps protect them, to bring them into the club. So in that sense, I would say there will be more of an emphasis on enlargement.
But we missed that opportunity. We have it after starting the aggression in Ukraine, but Montenegro ruined that opportunity.
Well, because of the nature of the political struggle here, as well as the, let's say, blocking influence from Serbia and from Russia, Montenegro in a way has been stifled from its progress. It's the front-line candidate. You know, it's
yes,
at the front of the queue.
It was.
It was, and it should be back there. That's where it should be.
So it is a part of some wider strategy to stop it or to slow it?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I've said. It's both a strategy to prevent Montenegro moving towards the European Union, but it's also part of the strategy to freeze Montenegro and even, I would say, divide and destabilize the society, the country, to show that NATO does not give the full protection that it's supposed to.
How do ordinary people recognize that in everyday life? Could you help to understand that?
Well, one would have to live here on a daily basis and follow the press, follow what politicians are saying, follow in particular what's coming from Belgrade and what's coming from Moscow about the country. But you know, sometimes it's easier to see what's going on from outside than it is when you're actually in the middle of it.
Yes.
And some of us outside of Ukraine, for instance, could see much more clearly that Ukraine was going to be invaded by Russia than even many Ukrainians believed. Some of them didn't believe this would happen. Same with Montenegro, I would say. Montenegrins may think things are going to continue the way they were before, everything's going to be fine, we don't need to do anything. But beware, there is always somebody looking over your shoulder to do something, to make your life difficult and not go in the direction that you want it to go.
How to deal with this?
to be more, let's say, to be more realistic about the political forces that are out there, to understand what the candidates stand for in elections, to make sure you vote, to make sure you vote for your country, for the reform program and for Montenegro's progress. And there's a lot you can do socially, you know, a lot more political discussion, a lot more education about what's going on, as well as the region. You know, Montenegro should not think of itself as simply one country. It's part of a region that's been, if not destabilized, undermined at this point by outside programs.
It is not so easy. Europe remains divided in its strategy toward Russia. Even now, the aggression against Ukraine is on the scene. It is not so easy. It's
not so easy, but the point I was trying to make is Europe is divided on how to deal with Russia after the war. In other words, there are those that say...
During the war also.
We'll bring Russia back in. You know, we'll have, again, trade relations and energy ties, Germany, France. But other countries, as, you know, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and so on, understand now, Russian imperialism has to end here. Otherwise, this is going to be a threat.
Here, where?
Within the border, between the borders of Russia and its neighbors. In other words, we don't want any more Russian negative influence in Belarus, in Ukraine, Georgia, Baltic states, all the other countries that were part of the Soviet Union.
Can you imagine that will happen during your professional life?
Yes, yes. I've just written a book, actually, that the next step is a Russian implosion. In other words, Russia is a failed state. I think it's disguising the fact that it's a failed state by its attack. Sometimes when a country is most weak, it attacks a neighbor to try and mobilize people, to get the military involved, to show that it's strong. I think Russia now is going to experience major internal turmoil that will end in the emergence of new states. And again, this is something, I mean, it's a subject for a whole show.
Yes, of course.
But it's yes. Something that we're not prepared for at all, like we were not prepared for the collapse of Yugoslavia.
When you said we, you were thinking West.
But even
how do you see, what will do Europe or United States in that situation?
I know what it should be doing. It should be looking at what relations it needs to form with which countries that will be emerging from Russia. It needs to work very closely with the countries that know Russia best. In other words, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states. And it needs to stop thinking back to the status quo. This is a new global strategic, let's say, a new world is emerging from this war in Ukraine, but we haven't yet come to terms with it. And it reminds me 30 years ago when communism collapsed, when the Soviet bloc collapsed, Soviet Union collapsed, we were not prepared, the West, I mean Washington, Brussels, were not prepared for what comes next.
And now?
And now we're also not prepared.
What will be the price?
The price will be floundering around. The price will be warning countries not to resist Russia. The price will be enabling Moscow to still generate instability in the region, rather than pushing back diplomatically, politically, and looking at the contours of the new, let's say, world order that is emerging.
For how long?
Oh, this could go on for years. This isn't good. This process...
Years, not decades. That is good news.
Well, I won't be around in decades, so I can only see as far as maybe the end. But I would say over the years, I would say over the next decade, we're going to see huge changes in what we used to call Russian Federation. Because it's not really a federation, and we don't know the size yet of Russia.
Could you even try to describe borders of that change?
I've talked about it, read my book. I talk about the sort of countries that could emerge. And in some cases, it could be federations or confederations of regions. And I'm not just talking about the ethnic republics. Remember, Russia has 22 republics that are not Russian. In other words, they're named after another ethnic group, ethno-national group. But there are also many regions that increasingly resent exploitation from Moscow. And some of them have a lot of resources. In Siberia, in the Urals, in the Far East, in the Far North. There are some very rich regions that at some point are going to say no more. We're not going to be exploited by Moscow.
Do you see an end to the aggression against Ukraine? It will be a first step in...
Absolutely. And I think Ukraine Ukraine is going to win this war. Again, I'm not going to tell you exactly how long it will take, but in the next, I would say in the next few weeks until the summer, expect some major fighting. Ukraine has been gearing up for a major counter-offensive, building up its forces. All the Western weapons are now reaching them. They've been reorganizing their military. The training of these Ukrainians in Britain, Poland, other places is now elite level. It's NATO level. So I would and Russia, on the other hand, enormous manpower losses. 200,000 Russian soldiers have either been killed or immobilized through injury. That's huge. That's a fifth of its army.
Let's return to politics in Montenegro. Have you met before any of the presidential candidates, except Đukanović, of course?
I know the other candidates, not personally, but I followed their backgrounds. I know what they stand for. So me personally, over a drink, a raki, no.
Okay, we'll go for our next panelist, Jelena Janušević. Have a question. Hello to you.
Good evening from Podgorica. I hope that this weather is not really bad for you and that you are enjoying our lovely country. I just have a quick question. What is your forecast for the outcome of the presidential elections? And what do you think will be the key point for our voters to decide on? Thank you.
Thank you for this question.
I don't have the results in front of me, but...
Are you sure?
It depends on you, the voter. I would encourage everybody to come out and vote for Montenegro and what in your heart you think is best for Montenegro. I can't tell you who to vote for. I can only tell you that there are some candidates that would probably drag Montenegro backward or maintain the stalemate. I think you need a candidate that will move the country, genuinely move the country forward, and somebody with a proven record. Somebody with some experience on knowing how to deal in the region and with Western policymakers. What was the second part of the question?
Could you repeat, please, Jelena?
Yes, of course. What do you think will be the key point for our voters to decide on?
The key point, I would say, is, do you want Montenegro to be a part of all the Western institutions? Not only NATO, but also the European Union. And do you want it to have a close relationship with the United States? Or do you want Montenegro to stagnate, to be under greater control from Belgrade, and to be part of some sort of Russian sphere? That is the ultimate choice.
Possibility of second round? What do you think?
It looks like there will be a second round, for sure. I mean, in some ways, it's healthy. It's good to have, different political options. Second round, I would say the important thing is, again, everybody should vote. You cannot say that we voted already, I'm not going to vote the second time. It's even more important to vote in the second round.
Yes. You have met, talked or collaborated with many important thinkers during your professional life, such as Zbigniew Brzezinski, including the closest associates of several American presidents, President Carter to President Biden, yeah. Who left the strongest impression on you?
Well, I think Zbig did, actually. Probably one of the most important strategic thinkers in Washington. He died a few years ago. Certainly, I would say, not only under Carter. Remember, President Reagan also wanted him as a national security advisor. He was a major figure for all presidents, both parties, Republican and Democrat. So I would say yes, he was probably the most important. I worked with him also for 30 years, so you get to know somebody after this time. But there are others I worked with, Kissinger and Scowcroft and these people as well. But I would say he was head and shoulders above everybody.
We don't have thinkers like those guys anymore. Why?
Unfortunately not.
Why?
It's a good question. Maybe it's because we don't have long-term strategy as much as we did then. During the Cold War, I think we developed people who understood Russia much better, who understood that there's a long-term American engagement in Europe that's necessary. And a lot of this has fallen by the wayside because everything has moved so fast. I think a lot of American policy makers think, well, Europe has been resolved in a way. We can pivot. Remember this idea of pivoting to the Pacific or dealing with other regions, which I think was a mistake. As we see in Europe, there are wars in Europe every generation. We cannot turn our back on Europe, look away and think the Europeans can handle it on their own. Finally, I would say, which is the most important European country? The United States.
It is good to know in this part of the world.
It's important and it's key. You know, without the United States, where would we be living here in Europe? Under the Nazis? Under the communists? Under something worse?
We are at the end of this show, but starting this March, once a month, you will broadcast for TVE from Washington. What should we expect?
Well, some of the things you were saying, Sonia. In other words, I'm a strong believer in this transatlantic dialogue or transatlantic platform that we can establish through such a show. In other words, Americans listening to what the Montenegrins are saying, what the Montenegrin aspirations are, what we need to do as Americans to help you. And then Montenegrins listening to what US policy is and where Montenegro fits into the picture. You know, partly what we were discussing here. How important are the Balkans for America? How can we make the Balkans more important for America? So this would be the idea of the show, to try and air and debate and even to come up with recommendations for what can be done to help Montenegro in its progress and also to help American policy.
So, transatlantic platform by Bugajski.
That's it.
That's it. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you. And thank you for the questions.
Hvala vam, dakle, hvala našim panelistima, hvala mom sagovorniku, hvala vama, poštovani gledalci, što ste pratili još jednu veliku debatu. Vidimo se naredne srede.